You don't walk through these doors unless you belong here." Brent Talley's voice hit like a slap across the sterile corridor, loud enough to freeze every head in the emergency room lobby. He stepped directly into the path of the woman in the grey joggers and the faded Howard University sweatshirt, blocking the hallway with his wide uniformed body like a human barricade. The woman looked at him. She didn't stop walking because he frightened her. She stopped because a 240-pound man was physically standing in her way, and going through him would cost time she did not have. She had no idea that within the next 53 minutes, a 12-year-old boy named Aidan Caldwell would flatline on a steel operating table because the only trauma surgeon in the state certified to perform an emergency retrohepatic vena cava repair was standing right here. Being told she didn't belong. It was 7:48 on a Saturday morning in early October, and the air outside Piedmont Regional Medical Center in northeast Atlanta carried the first real bite of autumn. Inside the emergency department, the atmosphere was something else entirely. It smelled of iodine, burnt coffee, and panic. 22 minutes earlier, a school bus carrying 31 children from a traveling youth soccer league had been T-boned by a cement truck that ran a red light on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard. The first ambulances were already screaming into the bay. Triage nurses were pulling on fresh gloves. The trauma pages had gone off hospital-wide, and every available surgeon had been called in from wherever Saturday morning had found them. Dr. Joelle Kimani had been found mid-stride on the Beltline Trail, 3 miles into her morning run, when her phone had erupted with the distinctive triple buzz of a level 1 trauma activation. She hadn't gone home to change. She hadn't stopped for her badge. She had sprinted to her car in the parking lot at Ponce City Market, cranked the ignition of her 10-year-old Honda Civic, and driven 11 minutes to the hospital at speeds that would have earned her a citation on any other day. She came through the ER's public entrance because it was 40 seconds closer to the trauma wing than the staff lot. She was wearing black Nike joggers, a crewneck sweatshirt faded soft from 100 washes, and a purple silk headwrap knotted neatly above her forehead. No lanyard, no white coat, no name embroidered over her left breast pocket. Just a black woman in athletic clothes walking fast through a hospital lobby at 7:48 in the morning, and to Brent Talley, that was all the information he needed. Joelle Kimani was 35 years old. She stood 5'7" and weighed 138 pounds, almost all of it functional lean muscle, built across a lifetime of relentless discipline. She had enlisted in the United States Army at 18, straight out of a crowded 3-bedroom apartment in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, where she'd shared a bunk bed with her younger sister and a bathroom with 6 people. She served as a combat medic with the 101st Airborne, deployed twice to Afghanistan's Helmand province, where she had performed emergency field surgery in conditions that would make most civilian doctors vomit and quit medicine. She had packed arterial bleeds with one hand, while mortar rounds shook the ground beneath her knees. She had kept a 19-year-old private alive for 47 minutes on a dusty roadside outside Sangin, with nothing but a tourniquet, a chest seal, and a calm voice, telling him he was going to see his mother again. The private lived. He sent her a Christmas card every year. After her second deployment, Joelle had earned her degree on the GI Bill, then medical school at Howard, then a surgical residency at Johns Hopkins that her attending physicians described as the most technically gifted they had seen in a decade. 3 months ago, she had been recruited to Piedmont Regional as the new chief of trauma surgery, the youngest person and only the second black woman to hold that title in the hospital's 90-year history. She was, by every conceivable metric, exactly where she was supposed to be. Brent Talley didn't see any of that. Brent Talley saw a black woman in sweats. Talley was 48 years old, 6'1", and carrying 243 pounds distributed across a frame that had once been athletic but had long since settled into the thick, heavy build of a man who confused physical size with personal authority. He was the hospital's director of security, a title that sounded more impressive than the reality. He had landed the position 4 years ago after a 17-year career with the DeKalb County Police Department came to an abrupt, quiet, mutually agreed-upon conclusion. The specifics were buried in sealed internal affairs files, but the broad strokes were well known among anyone who cared to look. 11 formal excessive force complaints. 3 separate civil settlements paid out by the county, totaling just under $900,000 in taxpayer money. a persistent pattern of targeting Black and Latino residents during traffic stops. Tally had never been formally charged because the police union's lawyers were very, very good at their jobs, and because the department found it cheaper and cleaner to let him resign with a partial pension than to fight the public relations war that a termination hearing would ignite. He was, in the most literal sense, a man the system had failed upward. At Piedmont Regional, Tally ran his small security team the way he had once run traffic stops in DeKalb County. He used volume, proximity, and the implied threat of force to control people he had already decided were beneath him. He was particularly aggressive with Black visitors in the ER waiting room, frequently demanding identification, questioning their reasons for being there, and once physically escorting a Black father out of the building for raising his voice at a triage nurse about his daughter's wait time. The father had been a Fulton County assistant district attorney. The hospital had quietly settled that complaint for $30,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. Tally hadn't been disciplined. He had been reminded to exercise discretion. I said, "Stop." Tally planted himself wider in the corridor, his thick hand rising to press flat against Joelle's shoulder. Not a shove, not yet. A placement. A physical assertion of ownership over the space between her and where she needed to go. "This is a restricted area. The waiting room's back there." He jerked his chin toward the crowded public lobby behind her without breaking eye contact. "Visiting hours haven't started. You need to turn around." Joelle looked down at the hand on her shoulder, then back up at his face. Her pulse was steady at 62 beats per minute. It had been 62 beats per minute when she was doing chest compressions on a sergeant in a Black Hawk helicopter over Kandahar, with tracer rounds lighting up the night sky outside the open bay door. A hospital security guard with coffee breath and a Napoleon complex didn't move the needle. "I'm Dr. Kimani. I'm on the trauma staff. I was called in for the MCI." She kept her voice level, clear and factually precise. She spoke the way she charted. Subject, verb, object, no ambiguity. "I need to get to Trauma Bay 1. Please remove your hand." Something shifted behind Tally's eyes. It was a look Joelle recognized from Hellmand, from Brooklyn, from 1,000 invisible moments that accumulated across a Black's life like scar tissue. It was the look of a man who had just been told something that contradicted his assumption and who had decided, instantly and irrevocably, that his assumption was correct and reality was lying. "Doctor?" Tally repeated. He let the word hang in the air, his lips curling around it like it tasted sour. He looked her up and down with a slow, theatrical sweep. The joggers, the sweatshirt, the headwrap. His hand did not move from her shoulder. "You don't look like any doctor I've ever seen. Where's your badge?" "I don't have it on me. I was called in from a run. Check the call roster, Dr. Joelle Kimani, trauma surgery." She reached slowly toward her pocket. "I can show you my hospital ID on my phone. Don't reach into your pockets." Tally's voice dropped into the low, commanding register. He had perfected over 17 years of traffic stops. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the tiny broken capillaries in his nose and smell the skull tucked in his lower lip. "Hands where I can see them. Now." Behind them in the waiting room, a woman was sobbing into her hands. Two paramedics rushed past with a gurney carrying a small body immobilized in a cervical collar, the child's soccer jersey still visible beneath the straps, the bright yellow fabric stained dark. Joelle could hear the overhead PA system cycling. "Dr. Kimani to Trauma 1, stat. Kimani to Trauma 1, stat." Her name, echoing through the building, being called into the air directly above the man who was refusing to let her pass. "Officer Tally." She read his name off his chest badge. "There are critically injured children in that trauma bay who need surgical intervention right now. I am the attending trauma surgeon on call. You need to let me through immediately." "What I need," Tally said, leaning in until his forehead was nearly touching hers, "is for you to stop lying to my face and get out of my emergency department before I have you removed. You people think you can just walk into any building and make up whatever story you want. I've seen it 100 times. Junkies, tweakers, scammers, all trying to get into the drug cabinets. You people." The words landed in the corridor like a grenade with the pin pulled. A registration clerk at the front desk looked up sharply. An elderly man in a wheelchair turned his head. A young paramedic unloading equipment from an ambulance bay froze mid-step, his face cycling through confusion and disbelief. "I'm going to ask you one final time," Joelle said. Her voice didn't waver, but it changed. It dropped into a register that anyone who had served in a combat zone would have recognized instantly. It was the voice of a person who had made life-and-death decisions under fire, who had triaged bleeding human bodies on dirt floors by flashlight, who understood with clinical precision exactly what the stakes of every passing second were. Step aside. Children are dying. Brent Talley decided to make the worst decision of his life. He grabbed Joelle Kimani by both arms, spun her around with the practiced violence of a man who had done this many times before, and slammed her face first into the corridor wall. Her cheekbone hit the painted cinder block with a dull, sickening crack. Before she could speak, he wrenched her arms behind her back, looped a white zip tie around her wrists, and ratcheted it tight enough to bite into her skin. He forced her down to the cold tile floor, driving his knee into the space between her shoulder blades. "I warned you," Talley grunted, breathing hard from the exertion. His knee ground deeper, trespassing, resisting, impersonating medical staff. "You just earned yourself a night in Fulton County." Joelle did not resist. She did not fight. She went still the way only a person with extensive training can go still, not out of submission, but out of calculation. She turned her face against the cold floor, positioning her jaw so she could breathe freely, and she spoke. Not to Talley, to the room. "My name is Dr. Joelle Kimani. I am the Chief of Trauma Surgery at this hospital. Service number 47762. My credentials are on file with Human Resources, the Chief Medical Officer, and the Georgia Composite Medical Board. There are children bleeding out in Trauma Bay 1 right now who will die without surgical intervention. Someone please call Dr. Helen Forsyth. Now." Her voice carried. It carried across the lobby, through the double doors, and into the ears of every person within 50 feet. Nothing happened for 7 seconds. 7 seconds that felt like 7 hours. Talley pressed harder on her back, convinced he had caught a particularly bold con artist. The 2 junior security guards who had jogged over stood behind him, uncertain, their hands hovering near their radios, but not touching them. They had never seen Talley this aggressive. One of them, a 24-year-old named Devon, felt something cold settle in his stomach. This felt wrong. The woman wasn't screaming, wasn't thrashing, wasn't doing anything a trespasser would do. She was reciting a service number. Then the double doors to the trauma wing slammed open. A woman in dark blue scrubs came running down the corridor, so fast her clogs were slapping against the linoleum. Tamara Wiley, a veteran ER charge nurse who had worked at Piedmont Regional for 14 years. She had been inside Trauma 1, preparing the surgical field, growing increasingly frantic as the overhead page for Dr. Kimani went unanswered for the 4th time. She had finally stepped out to physically locate the surgeon and instead found this. Tamara stopped dead. Her eyes went wide. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God." The words came out fractured, half whisper, half scream. "Oh my God, Brent. That is Dr. Kimani. That is our chief of trauma. Get off her. Get off her right now." The color drained from Brent Talley's face like water through a cracked glass. His knee did not move immediately. His brain, which had spent the last 4 minutes operating on a set of racist assumptions so deeply embedded they functioned like instinct, could not process the information quickly enough to override his body. "She doesn't have a badge," he said. His voice had changed. The command was gone. What replaced it was something thinner. She was trying to access a restricted. "I have been working with her for 3 moves." Tamara was screaming now, not out of hysteria but out of righteous volcanic fury. She shoved past the junior guards and physically pulled at Talley's arm. "There are 4 children in critical condition in there, and you have our surgeon on the floor. Get off. Get off, or so help me God I will call a code and have every person in this building on top of you in 30 seconds. Talley's knee lifted. He stood up slowly, his face cycling through a sickening spectrum of expressions. Denial, fear, the dawning, nauseating recognition that he had not caught a criminal. He had assaulted the most important person in the building. Devon, the young guard, dropped to his knees and cut the zip tie with the trauma shears he carried on his belt. Joelle's wrists were red, the skin already swelling where the plastic had bitten deep. She didn't rub them. She didn't look at Talley. She stood up, rolled her shoulders once, and turned toward the trauma wing. "How many critical?" she asked Tamara, already walking. 4. One's a 12-year-old with a grade 5 liver lac and suspected retrohepatic IVC tear. He's circling the drain, Joelle. His pressure's in the 60s. Joelle broke into a run. She hit the scrub sink at 8:07 a.m. She was gowned, gloved, and standing over Aidan Caldwell's open abdomen by 8:11. The boy's liver was shattered. The inferior vena cava, the massive vein that returns blood from the lower body to the heart, was torn where it passed behind the liver, a catastrophic injury that killed the majority of people who sustained it. Blood was pooling faster than the suction could clear it. The anesthesiologist's voice was tight and flat, calling out dropping pressures in a tone that meant he was running out of options. Joelle's hands did not shake. They had never shaken. Not in Helmand, not at Hopkins, not now. She packed the liver, isolated the vena cava with atraumatic vascular clamps, and began the repair with the kind of precise, unhurried suture work that seemed to bend time itself. The OR team watched her hands move and felt the collective terror in the room quietly loosen its grip. At 8:34 a.m., Aidan Caldwell's blood pressure stabilized. At 8:51, the repair was complete. At 9:15, the anesthesiologist looked up from his monitors and said, quietly, "He's going to make it." Joelle nodded once. Then she moved to the next table. She operated for 11 hours straight. 4 children. 2 laparotomies, 1 thoracotomy, 1 emergency splenectomy on a 9-year-old girl whose spleen had ruptured in 2 places. She lost none of them. Every single child who came through Trauma Bay 1 that day went home to their families. While Joelle was inside the operating room saving lives, the building outside was devouring Brent Talley alive. The hospital's closed-circuit security system had captured every second of the corridor confrontation in high-definition, multi-angle clarity. Camera 6, mounted above the ER registration desk, had recorded Talley's initial approach, his hand on Joelle's shoulder, and his face leaning aggressively into hers. Camera 9, positioned at the corridor junction, had captured the slam into the wall, the zip tie, and the knee in the back. With audio so clear you could hear the crack of Joelle's cheekbone against the cinder block, and Talley's grunted commentary about "you people" and junkies, doctor. Helen Forsyth, Piedmont Regional's chief medical officer, was a 61-year-old white woman with silver-grey hair, steel-rimmed glasses, and a reputation for administrative ruthlessness that made hospital attorneys nervous. She watched the security footage once in her office. She watched it a second time. Then she picked up her phone and made 3 calls. The first was to Piedmont Regional's legal counsel. The second was to the DeKalb County Police Department. The third was to Brent Talley's desk. "Report to my office. Bring your badge and your keys. You're done." She hung up without waiting for a response. Talley was formally terminated at 10:22 a.m. He was escorted from the building by the same junior security guards who had watched him pin Joelle to the floor. Devon, the 24-year-old, held the door open for him and said absolutely nothing. His silence said everything. By the time Joelle finally walked out of the OR at 7:45 that evening, exhausted, dehydrated, with deep circles under her eyes and her wrists still bruised and swollen, she found the corridor outside the surgical wing lined with staff. Nurses, technicians, residents, custodial workers, cafeteria staff. They weren't cheering. They were just standing there, some crying quietly, some simply nodding at her as she passed. Tamara Wiley was leaning against the wall with her arms folded and tears cutting lines through the surgical mask, still dangling around her neck. She didn't say a word. She just put her hand on Joelle's arm as she walked by. The touch said everything. In the waiting room, Gloria Caldwell sat in a plastic chair with mascara streaked down her face, and her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She was the mother of Aidan Caldwell, the 12-year-old boy, whose heart had nearly stopped while his surgeon was face down on a tile floor. When Dr. Forsyth had quietly informed her of what had happened, what had nearly happened, Gloria had gone very still for a very long time. Then she had asked for the name of the security officer. Then she had asked for the name of a lawyer. The story broke in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution 48 hours later. A reporter had obtained the security footage through a source inside the hospital. The headline read, "Piedmont Regional Surgeon assaulted by security chief while children lay dying." The video hit social media that afternoon. Within 72 hours, it had been viewed 14 million times. The footage was devastating in its clarity. There was no ambiguity, no he said, she said, no room for the kind of narrative manipulation that so often allowed men like Talley to escape consequences. The cameras showed a calm, cooperative woman identifying herself clearly and repeatedly. They showed a man who never once attempted to verify her identity. They showed him choosing violence, not because she was a threat, but because she was black and didn't match the picture in his head of what a doctor was supposed to look like. The DeKalb County District Attorney's Office filed felony assault charges against Brent Talley within a week. But the case didn't stay local, because the assault had occurred in a facility that received federal Medicare funding. And because the racial motivation was so extensively documented, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened a parallel investigation under 18 U.S.C. Section 249, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Talley wasn't just facing a county court anymore. He was staring down the full, grinding machinery of federal prosecution. Gloria Caldwell filed a separate civil lawsuit against Piedmont Regional and against Talley personally, arguing that her son had been placed in imminent mortal danger by the hospital's failure to prevent its own security staff from detaining a physician based on racial bias. The complaint included a detailed medical timeline showing that Aiden's blood pressure had dropped to 52 systolic during the 19 minutes Joelle was restrained. At 50 systolic, the human brain begins to die. Her son had been 9 minutes from irreversible organ failure, 9 minutes separated from death by a zip tie on a black woman's wrists. The Caldwell lawsuit settled for an undisclosed amount that 3 separate legal analysts on cable news estimated was north of $8 million. Piedmont Regional issued a public statement expressing deep institutional regret and announced a comprehensive overhaul of its security protocols, including the immediate implementation of mandatory bias training, civilian complaint tracking, and the permanent installation of body cameras on all security personnel. They didn't mention Brent Talley by name. They didn't have to. Talley's federal trial took place 5 months later in the Northern District of Georgia Courthouse in downtown Atlanta. His defense attorney argued that Talley had been operating under reasonable suspicion and that his actions, while regrettably aggressive, were consistent with standard security protocols for an unauthorized individual in a restricted area. The prosecutor dismantled this argument methodically. She played the security footage 3 times. She called Tamara Wiley to the stand, who testified with barely contained fury that Talley had a documented pattern of singling out black visitors for confrontational interactions. She called Devon, the young guard, who testified that Talley had muttered, "Another one," trying to sneak in, as Joelle approached the entrance, before she had said a single word. She called an ER registration clerk, who testified that Talley routinely asked black visitors for identification at a rate roughly 4 times higher than white visitors with identical access credentials. The jury was out for 3 hours and 17 minutes. Guilty. All counts. Aggravated assault. Felony civil rights violation under color of authority. Willful obstruction of emergency medical care, a charge the prosecutors had added after the medical timeline revealed how close Aiden Caldwell had come to death. The sentencing hearing was brief. The federal judge, a woman named Judge Althea Ransom, reviewed Talley's sealed DeKalb County personnel file, which had been subpoenaed and unsealed during discovery. 11 excessive force complaints, 3 settlements, a documented pattern spanning nearly 2 decades of targeting black residents with disproportionate aggression. None of it had ever resulted in meaningful discipline. All of it was now public record. Judge Ransom sentenced Brent Talley to 9 years in federal prison. As she read the sentence, she added a statement from the bench that would be quoted in every major newspaper in the country. The following morning, she said that the case was not merely about one man's violence, but about the compounding institutional failures that had allowed that violence to continue, unchecked and unpunished, for 17 years. She said that Brent Talley had been given a badge and a uniform, and had used them as weapons against the people he was supposed to protect. And she said that a 12-year-old boy had nearly paid for that failure with his life. Talley stood in his suit with his hands cuffed in front of him and said nothing. His face was grey. His shoulders were rounded. He looked for the first time in anyone's memory, small. On the day the verdict was read, Joelle Kimani was not in the courtroom. She was in operating room 3 at Piedmont Regional, repairing a lacerated kidney on a 17-year-old boy who had been stabbed in a parking lot outside a Waffle House on Moreland Avenue. Her hands were steady. Her focus was absolute. She had not followed the trial. She had given her testimony, clearly and without emotion, and then she had gone back to work. That was what she did. She had been saving lives since she was 20 years old in the red dust of Helmand province, and no man, no badge, no zip tie, no courtroom was going to change that or slow her down. 3 weeks after the trial, A reporter from the Washington Post tracked Joelle down for a profile piece. The reporter asked her how she felt about the verdict. Joelle thought about it for a moment. Then she said something that the reporter told her editor was the best quote she had gotten in 20 years of journalism. "I'm glad justice was served," Joelle said. "But I need people to understand something. I shouldn't have had to be a surgeon for what he did to me to matter. I shouldn't have had to save 4 children's lives that day for the world to care that a man slammed my face into a wall because of the color of my skin. What about the woman who comes through that same door, and she's not a doctor? What about the woman who's there to visit her sick mother, and she's wearing the same joggers and the same headwrap and the same skin? Does she not deserve to walk through a door without being brutalized? Because I promise you, the bruises feel exactly the same." The quote went viral. It was shared 11 million times across social media in a single week. It was printed on protest signs. It was read aloud on the floor of the United States Senate by a congresswoman from Georgia who entered it into the official record. It became, for a brief and incandescent moment, the clearest articulation of a truth that millions of people had always known but had never heard spoken with such devastating, quiet precision. Brent Talley sits in a federal correctional facility in Jesup, Georgia. His pension is gone. His badge is gone. His name, when it appears in public, appears only in the context of what he did and what it cost. He has 9 years to sit with that. Aiden Caldwell is 14 now. He plays goalkeeper for his club soccer team. He has a scar on his abdomen that runs from his sternum to his navel, a permanent map of the night his body was broken open and put back together by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Every year on the anniversary of the accident, his mother drives him to Piedmont Regional, and they leave a handwritten card at the surgical department's front desk addressed to Dr. Kimani. The cards are short. They say thank you. They say he scored a goal last weekend. They say he's thinking about becoming a doctor. Joelle keeps every single one of them in the top drawer of her desk, right next to the Christmas cards from a former Army private in Topeka, Kansas, who still writes to her every December to tell her he's alive, that his kids are growing, that he remembers the calm voice in the dust that told him he was going to see his mother again. She never writes back to either of them. She doesn't need to. The fact that they're alive to send the cards is the only reply that matters.